Martha Henderson wiped the sweat from her forehead as she looked ahead at the dusty trail. The Kansas sun had been beating down on their small wagon train for hours, and her back ached from sitting on the hard wooden seat. Beside her, her younger brother Thomas bounced with excitement, pointing at every bird and rock formation they passed. "Look, Martha, those mountains are getting bigger," Thomas called out, his 19-year-old enthusiasm infectious despite the long journey. Martha smiled at her brother's wonder. At 23, she had seen enough of the world to know that beautiful views often came with hidden dangers. Still, she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Their uncle's letter had promised good land near Silver Creek, Colorado Territory. After their parents died in the winter fever 2 years ago, this inheritance felt like a gift from heaven. The wagon train consisted of only 6 families, much smaller than Martha had expected. Their guide, a thin man named Peterson, had assured them it would be safer this way. "Smaller groups move faster," he had said with confidence. "We'll beat the spring rains to the river crossings." But as they traveled deeper into Colorado Territory, Martha began to notice things that worried her. Peterson often stopped to check his compass, frowning at the needle as if it was telling him something he didn't want to hear. The other families whispered among themselves during the evening camps, and she caught fragments of conversations about taking the wrong trail and should have gone north. The weather had been strange, too. Instead of the mild spring days Peterson had promised, they faced sudden temperature drops and heavy morning frost. The horses grew restless, and the children in the other wagons cried more often. Martha's teaching experience had taught her to read the signs when things were going wrong, and every instinct told her they were heading into trouble. On the morning of the 5th day, they crested a hill and saw the Arkansas River below them. Martha's heart sank. The river looked nothing like the gentle stream Peterson had described. Spring snowmelt from the mountains had turned it into a raging torrent of brown water and debris. Entire trees rushed past in the current, and the normal crossing point was completely underwater. "That doesn't look right," Thomas said quietly. His excitement finally dampened. Martha watched as Peterson rode ahead to the river's edge. Even from a distance, she could see his shoulders slump as he surveyed the crossing. When he returned to the group, his face was pale. "The water's a bit higher than usual," he announced, trying to sound casual, "but we can make it across. We just need to be careful." Mr. Davies, the blacksmith traveling with his wife and 2 small children, shook his head. "That river's running fast enough to knock a horse off its feet. Maybe we should wait a few days for it to go down." Peterson's jaw tightened. "We can't afford to wait. There's another storm coming from the west, and if we get caught on this side, we'll be stuck for weeks. We cross today?" Martha studied the sky. She could see the dark clouds Peterson mentioned, but they still seemed far away. Something about his urgency felt wrong, like he was hiding something important. She had learned to trust her instincts during her years teaching difficult students, and right now those instincts were screaming danger. "Thomas," she whispered, "check that our supplies are tied down tight, and put on your heaviest boots." Her brother looked at her with concern. "You think we're really going to try crossing that?" Before she could answer, Peterson was already directing the first wagon toward the water. The Davies family went first, with Peterson riding alongside them. Martha watched in horror as their wagon lurched violently the moment it entered the current. Mrs. Davies screamed as water poured over the sides, soaking their belongings. The horses struggled against the pull of the water, their eyes wide with fear. By some miracle, they made it across, but just barely. The wagon was half full of water, and little Katie Davies was crying hysterically. Peterson waved from the other side, shouting something the wind carried away. "We're next," announced Mr. Carter, the merchant who had been traveling with his teenage son. Martha watched as they entered the water, moving more slowly than the Davies family had. For a moment it seemed like they might make it to. Then disaster struck. A massive log, hidden beneath the surface, slammed into their wagon with tremendous force. The impact threw both Carter and his son into the water. The horses, panicked and fighting the current, pulled the wagon sideways. Within seconds, the entire outfit was swept downstream. Martha jumped from her seat, running along the bank as far as she could, but the current was too fast. She watched helplessly as the Carters disappeared around a bend in the river. The silence that followed was deafening. "We're not crossing," she said firmly, turning back to Thomas. "We'll wait for the water to go down." But Peterson was already riding back across, his face grim with determination. "We have to go now," he shouted over the roar of the water. "That storm's moving faster than I thought. If we don't cross in the next hour, we'll be trapped here for days, maybe weeks." The other families looked uncertain. Martha could see the fear in their eyes, but also the worry about being stranded. Food supplies were running low, and the idea of spending weeks camped beside this dangerous river clearly terrified them. "I say we wait," Martha called out. "Did you see what happened to the Carters? That water's too dangerous." Peterson's face darkened. "Miss Henderson, I've been guiding people across rivers for 10 years. I know what I'm doing. We can make it if we're careful." "But the Carters were careful too," Thomas pointed out, his voice shaking slightly. "They made a mistake," Peterson snapped. "They went too fast. We'll take our time, stay close to the bank where the current's weaker." Martha looked at the river. Again, the water seemed to be rising even as they spoke, and more debris was flowing past. Everything in her experience told her this was a terrible idea, but she could see that Peterson wasn't going to listen to reason. The remaining families huddled together, debating in urgent whispers. Martha caught fragments of their conversation. ... Can single quote stay here with winter coming ... What if the storm lasts for days ... Running out of food already ... In the end, fear of being stranded won out over fear of the crossing. One by one, the families agreed to attempt the river. Martha felt sick to her stomach, but she and Thomas were outnumbered. If they refused to cross, they would be left alone, on the wrong side of the river with no guide and no supplies. "All right," she said finally, her voice heavy with dread. "But we go slowly and we stay as close to the bank as possible." Peterson nodded, though Martha noticed he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "That's the plan. Keep your wagon light, and if anything goes wrong, jump clear and swim for shore." As they prepared for the crossing, Martha made Thomas put on every piece of warm clothing they had. She packed their most important documents in a waterproof pouch and tied it around her waist. Something deep inside her knew this was going to end badly, but there was no turning back now. The water was ice cold and stronger than anything she had ever experienced. Within seconds of entering the river, Martha realized they had made a terrible mistake. The current grabbed their wagon like a giant hand, pulling them away from the bank despite the horses' desperate struggles. Thomas gripped her arm so tightly. She could feel his fingernails through her sleeve. "Hold on," she shouted. But her words were lost in the roar of the water. That's when she saw the massive tree trunk rushing toward them through the churning brown water, and Martha knew their world was about to change forever. The tree trunk hit their wagon with the force of a cannonball. Martha heard the sickening crack of wood splintering, then felt herself flying through the air. The ice-cold water hit her like a slap, driving the breath from her lungs. Everything became a blur of brown water and spinning debris. She fought to keep her head above the surface, her heavy skirts dragging her down like anchors. The current was impossibly strong, pulling her away from everything familiar. Through the chaos, she heard Thomas screaming her name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. "Thomas!" She tried to shout back, but water filled her mouth. Instead of words, a piece of their wagon's wooden side floated past, and Martha grabbed it desperately. The sharp edge cut into her palms, but she held on with every ounce of strength she had. The broken wood became her lifeline as the river carried her downstream like a leaf in a hurricane. She couldn't see Thomas anywhere. The other wagons had disappeared completely. There was only the roaring water and the terrible certainty that she was going to die in this river. Far from home, far from anything that mattered, the current slammed her against a boulder, and pain shot through her left shoulder. She nearly lost her grip on the wooden board, but somehow managed to hold on. Her vision blurred from the impact, but she could see the riverbank getting closer. The water was pushing her toward a small inlet where the current seemed weaker, with her last reserves of strength. Martha kicked toward shore. Her boots felt like lead weights, and her soaked dress wrapped around her legs like ropes. But inch by inch, she fought her way closer to land. When her feet finally touched solid ground, she collapsed immediately. Unable to take another step, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Martha lay on the muddy riverbank, shivering uncontrollably. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and blood seeped from cuts on her hands and arms. But she was alive, and that seemed like a miracle. She tried to call out for Thomas, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The river continued its relentless roar, drowning out any other sounds. As darkness began to fall, Martha realized with growing horror that she was completely alone. No other survivors had made it to this stretch of riverbank. No rescue party was coming. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared. Martha's wet clothes clung to her skin like ice, and her teeth chattered so violently she could barely think straight. She knew she had to move, to find shelter, or she would freeze to death before morning. But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Fear crept into her mind like a cold fog. She had always been the strong one, the one who took care of others. After their parents died, she had held everything together for Thomas. During the journey west, she had been the voice of reason when others panicked. But now, injured and alone beside this terrible river, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she thought about Thomas, hoping desperately that he had somehow made it to safety. The idea that she might never see her brother again was almost too painful to bear. That's when she heard the sound of horse hooves on stone dot at first. Martha thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But the sound grew closer, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Someone was riding along the ridge above the river, moving slowly and carefully in the darkness. "Help!" she tried to call out, but her voice was too weak. She searched the muddy ground around her until she found a small stone, which she threw in the direction of the sound. It clattered against a rock, creating a small echo. The horse sound stopped immediately. Martha held her breath, praying that whoever was up there had heard her. Long seconds passed in silence, broken only by the constant rush of water. Then she heard a man's voice, rough but not unkind. "Hello? Someone down there?" "Here," Martha managed to croak, her voice barely carrying over the river's noise. "I'm here." She heard the horse moving again, this time coming down the slope toward the water. A few minutes later, a figure emerged from the shadows. In the dim moonlight, Martha could make out a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a heavy coat. He moved carefully across the rocky ground, leading his horse by the reins. When he reached her, he knelt down immediately, his weathered face full of concern. "Good Lord, what happened to you?" "Wagon train," Martha whispered. "River crossing. Everyone else ... She didn't need to finish. The man's expression told her he understood. He looked up and down the riverbank, then back at her injuries. Without saying another word, he shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said quietly. "I've got a camp up on the ridge. Can you ride?" Martha tried to nod, but even that small movement made her dizzy. Jake seemed to understand. He whistled softly, and his horse moved closer. It was a sturdy brown Marais with kind eyes and a gentle manner. "Easy now," Jake murmured, more to the horse than to Martha. "We've got someone who needs help." He helped Martha to her feet, supporting most of her weight with his strong arm. She was surprised by how gentle his touch was, despite his calloused hands and rough appearance. Everything about him spoke of years spent outdoors, but there was something careful and thoughtful in the way he moved. Getting onto the horse was difficult. Martha's injured shoulder screamed in protest, and her wet clothes made every movement awkward, but Jake was patient, never rushing her or making her feel foolish. When she was finally settled in the saddle, he took the reins and began leading the horse up the rocky slope. "My brother," Martha said weakly. "Thomas, he was in the wagon too." Jake's step faltered slightly, but he kept walking. I'll look for him in the morning. Right now, we need to get you warm and dry. His camp was simple but well organized. A small fire crackled between two large rocks, and his bedroll was spread nearby. Jake had clearly been preparing to settle in for the night when he heard her call for help. He helped her down from the horse and guided her to a spot near the fire. The warmth felt like heaven against her frozen skin. Jake disappeared for a moment and returned with a thick blanket and a tin cup filled with hot coffee. The coffee was stronger than anything Martha had ever tasted, but it spread warmth through her body like lit sunlight. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. Jake nodded and busied himself checking her injuries. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined her shoulder and cleaned the cuts on her arms. He worked mostly in silence, but Martha noticed how his jaw tightened when he saw the worst of her wounds. "You're lucky," he said finally. "That river's claimed a lot of folks over the years. Not many make it out?" Martha closed her eyes, letting the warmth and exhaustion wash over her. For the first time since the wagon had overturned, she felt safe. This stranger with the kind eyes and gentle hands had pulled her back from the edge of death itself. As sleep began to claim her, she heard Jake moving around the camp, adding wood to the fire and checking on his horse. His presence was steady and reassuring like a lighthouse in a storm. She didn't know it yet, but this moment by the fire would change everything. Martha woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The blanket wrapped around her was rough but warm, and sunlight filtered through her closed eyelids. Then the memories rushed back: the river, the wagon overturning, Thomas's screams, and the stranger who had saved her life. She opened her eyes to find Jake crouched beside the fire, turning strips of bacon in a cast-iron pan. His movements were efficient and quiet, like someone who had cooked countless meals over open flames. When he noticed she was awake, he looked up with those same kind eyes she remembered from the night before. "Morning," he said simply. "How's the shoulder?" Martha tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through her left side and she gasped. Jake was beside her in an instant, helping her find a more comfortable position. "Take it easy," he said gently. "You took quite a beating in that river. Nothing's broken, but you'll be sore for a while." The bacon smelled wonderful, and Martha realized she was hungrier than she had been in days. Jake served her a plate with bacon, beans, and thick slices of bread. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. It was simple food, but it tasted better than any fancy meal she had ever had. "Did you double quotes?" she started to ask, then stopped. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Jake understood immediately. "I rode down to the river at first light. Searched for about 3 miles in both directions." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I found pieces of wagons, some supplies scattered on the banks, but no people, I'm sorry." Martha nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had known in her heart that Thomas was gone, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the stomach. Jake seemed to sense her struggle and busied himself cleaning up from breakfast, giving her space to process the news. "Where will you go now?" he asked after a while. Martha stared at the dying fire. She had no idea. The inheritance from her uncle was supposed to be near Silver Creek, but she had no money to get there, no supplies, and no way to prove who she was. All their documents had been in the wagon. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I'll have to find work in the nearest town." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've got a small ranch about 15 miles from here. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and 4 walls. You could stay there while you figure things out." Martha looked at him in surprise. "I couldn't impose on you like that. You've, done enough already." "It's not an imposition," Jake said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're hurt and you've lost everything. It's the right thing to do." There was something in his tone that made Martha study his face more carefully. Behind his weathered features, she saw a deep sadness that matched her own. This wasn't just kindness to a stranger, this was something more personal. "Why?" she asked quietly. Jake stared at the ground for a long time before answering. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. And because nobody should have to face that alone. 2 hours later, they were riding slowly through rolling hills covered in spring grass. Martha rode behind Jake on his horse, her injured shoulder making it difficult to hold on. But Jake was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest and adjusting. Their pace to match her needs, the ranch, when they finally reached it, was smaller than Martha had expected. A simple log cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by a wooden fence. There was a small barn, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that looked like it had been recently planted. Everything was neat and well maintained, but there was something lonely about the place. Jake helped her down from the horse and led her to the cabin. Inside it was clean but sparse. A table and 2 chairs sat near the window, and a bed occupied one corner. What struck Martha most was how quiet everything was. This was clearly the home of a man who lived alone and had grown used to solitude. "You can have the bed," Jake said, already moving his few belongings to make room for her. "I'll sleep in." The barn. "I can't take your bed," Martha protested. "You can and you will," Jake replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're injured and you need proper rest." Over the next few days, Martha began to understand more about her rescuer. Jake was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He brought her meals at regular times, changed the bandages on her cuts with surprising gentleness, and never once made her feel like a burden. She learned that he raised horses, breeding them for the cavalry and local ranchers. He had a small herd of about 20 animals, and Martha could see that he knew each one individually. When he worked with the horses, his entire demeanor changed. The sadness lifted from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. Martha found herself drawn to the window during the day, watching Jake work. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life around animals. The horses responded to him with trust and affection, and she began to understand why. There was something genuinely peaceful about his presence. On the 3rd day, she felt strong enough to venture outside. Jake was in the corral, working with a young mare that seemed nervous and skittish. Martha leaned against the fence, watching him speak to the animal in low, soothing tones. "She's beautiful," Martha said when Jake paused in his work. "She's had a hard time," Jake replied, running his hand along the mare's neck. "Previous owner wasn't kind to her. Takes patience to earn back trust once it's been broken." Martha wondered if he was talking about more than just the horse. "How long have you been here?" "About 4 years," Jake said. "Built most of it myself." "It must get lonely," Martha observed, Jake's hand stilled on the mare's neck. "Sometimes. But it's peaceful, too. No one to disappoint, no one to worry about losing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Martha sensed there was a story behind them, but she didn't push. She was beginning to understand that Jake revealed things slowly, in his own time. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Martha tried to make conversation. "Tell me about the horses. How did you learn to work with them?" Jake's eyes softened slightly. "My father taught me. He had a way with animals that I've never seen matched. Could gentle the wildest bronco just by talking to it." He paused, staring into the flames. "He always said that broken things could be fixed, but it took patience and the right touch." "Sounds like a wise man," Martha said. "He died when I was 17. Left me this piece of land and everything he knew about horses." Martha waited, sensing there was more to the story. After a long moment, Jake continued, "I was married once. Her name was Rebecca. We had a baby girl." His voice became very quiet. "Fever took them both 3 winters ago. Been just me and the horses ever since." The pain in his voice was so raw that Martha's heart ached for him. She understood now why he had been so quick to help her, why he seemed to understand loss so deeply. They were both survivors, both carrying wounds that might never fully heal. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Jake nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without asking for pity. "Some days are harder than others, but work helps." "The horses help, and now—" He looked at her across the fire. "Having someone else here, someone who understands what it means to start over, it helps too." Martha felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time since the river crossing, she felt like she might have found not just shelter, but something that looked like hope. 2 weeks had passed since Martha arrived at the ranch, and she was feeling stronger each day. Her shoulder barely bothered her anymore, and the cuts on her hands had healed to faint pink lines. More importantly, she had found a rhythm in this quiet life that surprised her with its contentment. She woke each morning to the sound of Jake starting the fire and preparing coffee. After breakfast, he would head out to tend the horses while she took care of the cabin and the small vegetable garden. In the afternoons, she often found herself drawn to the corral, watching him work with the animals. Today was different, though. Jake had asked her to help him with the nervous mare, the one he called Stella. The horse had been making progress, but she still shied away from most human contact. Jake thought having a woman's voice might help calm her. Just talk to her? Jake said, his voice low and encouraging. Doesn't matter what you say. She needs to hear that not all people mean harm. Martha approached the fence slowly, keeping her movements gentle and predictable. Stella's ears flicked forward with curiosity, though she remained at the far end of the corral. Hello, beautiful girl, Martha said softly. I know you're scared. I was scared too not long ago. To her surprise, Stella took a small step closer. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile Martha had seen from him since she arrived. Keep talking, he whispered. She's listening. Martha told Stella about the river crossing, about feeling lost and alone, about finding safety in unexpected places. The horse's ears stayed forward, and gradually she moved closer to the fence. When Stella was finally close enough, Martha very slowly extended her hand, palm up. The mare sniffed cautiously, then gently nuzzled Martha's palm. The touch was feather-light, but it felt like a small miracle. She trusts you, Jake said, wonder in his voice. That's the first time she's let anyone besides me touch her. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. Something about this moment, the trust of a frightened animal, Jake's obvious joy, the afternoon sun warming her back, made her realize how much her life had changed. A month ago, she had been a school teacher heading west with her brother. Now she was standing in a corral in Colorado, helping to heal a broken horse alongside a man who had become more important to her than she wanted to admit. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jake pulled out an old Bible with worn leather covers. Would you mind reading to me? He asked, almost shyly. I can make out most words, but you have a teacher's voice. Makes it easier to understand. Martha took the book gently. The pages were soft with age, and she could see that it had been well loved. She opened to the Book of Psalms and began to read. Her voice filled the quiet cabin, and she noticed how Jake's face relaxed as he listened. When she finished the chapter, Jake was quiet for a long moment. Rebecca used to read to me like that, he said finally. I never learned real well as a boy. My father thought working with horses was more important than book learning. It's never too late to learn, Martha said gently. If you'd like, I could teach you. I have experience with students who started reading later in life. Jake looked at her with something like hunger in his eyes. You do that? Of course. Teaching is what I do, or what I used to do anyway. You're still a teacher, Jake said firmly. Just because you're not in a schoolhouse doesn't mean you're not teaching. You've been teaching me things every day since you got here? Martha felt her cheeks warm. Like what? Like how to have a real conversation again. How to laugh at something other than a horse's antics. How to look forward to meals because there's someone to share them with. The honesty in his words made Martha's heart race. She had been trying not to think about her growing feelings for Jake, telling herself it was just gratitude for his kindness. But sitting here in the firelight, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. Their reading lessons became a nightly ritual. Jake was a quick learner, and Martha found herself looking forward to the quiet hour. They spent together, his dark head bent over the pages as he worked through difficult passages. Sometimes their fingers would brush when she pointed out a word, and those small touches sent warmth shooting through her entire body. One evening, as spring rain drummed against the cabin roof, Jake struggled with a particularly difficult verse. Martha leaned closer to help him, and suddenly they were face to face, only inches apart. The air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. "Martha," Jake said softly, his voice rough with emotion. She should have pulled back, should have maintained the careful distance they had been keeping. Instead, she found herself studying his face, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes from years of sun and wind, the mouth that was usually so serious but could smile with such surprising warmth. "I know I shouldn't feel this way," Jake whispered. "You've been through so much, and I'm just a rancher with nothing to offer, but I can't help it. You've brought something back to life in me that I thought died with Rebecca." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. "Jake, I know. It's not right to ask," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "You'll want to move on, find your own life. But these past weeks, having you here, it's been like finding color in a world that had gone gray." Martha reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "What if I don't want to move on?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Jake's eyes searched hers as if trying to read her true feelings. "You don't know what you're saying?" he said finally. "This ranch, this life, it's isolated, hard. You're used to civilization, to being around people." "I'm used to being lonely in a crowd," Martha replied. "Here, with you, I feel more myself than I have in years." Jake closed his eyes as if her words caused him physical pain. "I'm scared, Martha. I lost everything once. I don't know if I could survive losing someone again." Martha understood his fear because she felt it too. Love meant vulnerability, and both of them had already paid a terrible price for opening their hearts. But sitting here in the lamplight, with rain pattering on the roof and Jake's hand warm in hers, she realized that some risks were worth taking. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "But I'm more scared of walking away from this, from you, than I am of staying." Jake opened his eyes as she saw hope warring with fear in their depths. "Are you sure, really sure?" Instead of answering with words, Martha leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle at first, tentative like Stella's first touch. But when Jake's arms came around her, pulling her closer, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and hope and the courage to love again. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he whispered. "Neither did I," Martha replied. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe the best things come when we're not looking for them." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls had found their way back to warmth and light. And for the first time since the river crossing, Martha felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The rider appeared on the horizon on a Tuesday morning in late May, just as Martha was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin. She had been living at the ranch for almost 2 months now, and visitors were rare. Jake looked up from the corral, where he was working with a young colt, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept nearby. But as the rider came closer, Martha's heart nearly stopped. Even from a distance, she recognized the way he sat in the saddle, the familiar tilt of his head. It couldn't be, but somehow it was. "Thomas," she whispered, then louder. "Thomas." She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran toward the approaching rider. Jake followed, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. As the rider drew closer, Martha could see that it really was her brother, though he looked thinner and older than when she had last seen him in the rushing river. Thomas dismounted before. His horse had even stopped moving and swept Martha into a fierce hug. Both of them were crying, holding each other as if they were afraid the other might disappear. "I thought you were dead," Martha sobbed into his shoulder. "I searched for you." "But the river." "I thought the same about you," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Denver. Some folks found me downstream, nearly drowned. I've been searching for you ever since." Jake stood a respectful distance away, but Martha could see the tension in his shoulders. She pulled back from Thomas, wiping her eyes, and gestured for Jake to come closer. "Thomas, this is Jake Morrison." He saved my life that night. Jake, this is my brother Thomas." The two men shook hands, sizing each other up. Thomas looked tired from his journey, but his eyes were sharp as he studied Jake. Martha could practically see him taking in the details. The way Jake stood protectively near her, how comfortable she seemed on the ranch, the obvious care that had gone into maintaining the place. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Thomas said seriously. "Taking care of my sister, giving her a place to recover." Jake nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "She's been no trouble, actually been a help around here." Over dinner that night, Thomas told them his story. After the wagon overturned, he had been swept much further downstream than Martha. A family traveling to Denver had found him unconscious on a riverbank and taken him to the hospital. He had been in a coma for 3 days, and when he woke up, he had no memory of how he got there. "The doctor said I was lucky to be alive," Thomas explained. "I had a bad head injury and nearly drowned. Took me weeks to recover enough to start looking for you." He had spent the past month following every lead he could find, talking to survivors from other wagon trains, checking with town sheriffs, even posting notices in newspapers. Finally, a rancher in Silver Creek had mentioned seeing a woman matching Martha's description with a horse rancher north of town. "I never gave up hope," Thomas said, reaching across the table to squeeze Martha's hand. "I knew you were too stubborn to die in that river." Martha laughed, but she noticed how quiet Jake had become during the conversation. He answered Thomas's questions politely, but didn't volunteer much. She could see him withdrawing, building walls around himself like he had when she first arrived, after Thomas had gone to sleep in the barn. Martha found Jake sitting outside, staring up at the stars. She sat beside him on the wooden bench he had built near the cabin. "You're planning to leave with him," Jake said quietly. It wasn't a question. Martha felt her heart clench. "Jake, ... It's all right," he said, though his voice betrayed his pain. "I always knew this day would come. Thomas is your family. He needs you. What if I don't want to go?" Jake turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his face. "Martha, he's your brother, your only family. You can't abandon him." "I wouldn't be abandoning him. He's a grown man, Jake. He can take care of himself." "But what about your uncle's land, your inheritance? That's why you came west in the first place." Martha had been thinking about this very question for weeks. "The land doesn't matter anymore. I don't even know if the deed survived the river crossing, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to live alone on some remote homestead." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "This ranch isn't much," he said finally. "It's small, isolated. You'd be giving up the chance for a real life in a real town." "This is a real life," Martha said firmly. "Our life, the one we've been building together." Over the next few days, Thomas explored the ranch and got to know Jake better. Martha watched nervously as her brother observed everything with a critical eye. Thomas had always been protective of her, and she worried about what he thought of her relationship with Jake. On the third day, Thomas approached her while she was working in the garden. "You love him," he said without preamble, Martha's hands stilled on the tomato plant she was tending. "Yes, and he loves you, yes," Thomas nodded slowly. "I can see it. The way he looks at you, the way he takes care of things around here, this isn't just about gratitude, is it?" "No," Martha said, "it's not." "Then why do you look so worried?" Martha sighed and sat back on her heels. "Because I'm afraid you'll think I'm making a mistake. Because I'm afraid you'll try to convince me to leave with you." Thomas knelt beside her in the dirt. "Martha, I've been watching you for 3 days. I've seen you laugh more in that time than you did in the entire year after Mother and Father died. You belong here. Anyone with eyes can see that." Tears sprang to Martha's eyes. "Really? Really? Jake's a good man. He's built something solid here, and he looks at you like you're the most precious thing in the world. I couldn't ask for better for my sister." That evening, Thomas made an announcement at dinner. "I've decided to head back to Denver," he said. "There's talk of the railroad coming through, and I think I can find work there." Martha felt a pang of sadness, but also relief. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I've got my whole life ahead of me, and now I know you're safe and happy." "That's all I ever wanted." Jake cleared his throat. Thomas, before you go, there's something I need to ask you. He turned to Martha, his face serious but his eyes warm. Martha, I know this isn't the most romantic way to do this, but I want to do it right. Will you marry me? Martha's heart soared. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, of course I will. Thomas grinned and clapped Jake on the shoulder. I was wondering when you'd get around to asking. 2 weeks later, on a sunny morning in June, Martha stood outside the little cabin wearing a simple white dress that Thomas had bought for her in town. Jake waited beside her, handsome in his best shirt and jacket. The traveling preacher had arrived the night before, and a few neighboring ranchers had come to witness the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Martha looked out at the land that had become home. The horses grazed peacefully in the pasture, and the garden was flourishing. It wasn't the life she had planned when she left Kansas, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have imagined. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The preacher asked. I do, Jake said, his voice strong and sure. And do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Martha looked into Jake's eyes, seeing her future reflected. There, I do. As they kissed to seal their union, Martha thought about the river that had nearly claimed her life but had ultimately led her to love. Sometimes the most dangerous currents carried you exactly where you needed to be. The celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing under the stars. As Martha danced with her new husband, she felt complete for the first time since her parents' death. She had found her place in the world, and it was right here in Jake's arms. On this small ranch in Colorado, the river had taken much from her, but it had also given her everything that truly mattered.